继续 Braid 时空幻境的周年重制版。啊，这 BGM 虽然是切回来了，看来你只要重启啊就会切回来。上一期结束那会儿是已经换成了什么？哎，叫什么来着？现在这个是 Main 内关的 BGM 是什么来着？应该是能看得到的。还在 Monologue， 这期不知道能不能结束掉。不算的什么 Alternative Design 的话，应该能搞定。好烦。还需要上去吗？BGM 的话在哪儿来着？好像在顶层是吧？那还是先上去。稍微找一下。音乐难道在相对比较早的地方吗？不太记得了。啊，这个是 Three Easy Pieces。啊，看来是确实比较早。啊，可能这个是吧？啊，果然这个。啊 ，Horse 跟 Main 你是可以切换的。如果切换成 Horse 的话，直到这期结束前重新再打开这游戏都是这曲的。啊，这两个是看过了，那先往下走，先把这看了吧。Why are the bunnies in？ 为什么要设计这种兔子？我操！啊，这东西你要想，克罗塞，这个小兔子好烦呐！Nice。啊，就是一个拼图。Why are there bunnies in the game？ 这样就来不及吧？对的，这地方还挺难的，最好可能要等一会儿。这样可以，稍微在这个地方等一会儿，看来正经。来
What inspired you to design the rabbits? And why are they so cute?
There were a few thoughts, right? So at first I'm like, I need more stuff in this game. Because I was trying to be minimal about it. And I felt like just having a little linear monster and a cannonball and a cloud was like not quite enough for the full game. But I didn't want to go crazy and add a bunch of things. So I was thinking about it like is there a hierarchy of stuff? Well, also the little claw plant that goes up and down, right? So, okay, there's a monster that basically doesn't move, it just goes up and down. There's one that moves linearly and could fall off platforms. But neither of those, like, makes decisions. Like, neither is, like, running code to do things in the way that used to be called AI, although that's becoming a very confusing term. So I wanted something that makes different basic decisions. And then, why is it a rabbit? Well, I mean, like a lot of little nerdsters, I liked Monty Python and the Holy Grail when I was a kid. So this is like have you seen this movie? Are you too young to know this movie? Okay. So there's a very dangerous rabbit in that movie. And it's funny. And it's one of those things that you grow up and you're like, oh man, that's really funny. And so, you know, when you're making a game, you kind of want to do the things that you like. And so it was just easy to do that. It's also sort of crossed, you know, the name for that entity in the code is mimic because it like looks like a flower, and there are non-mimic flowers in the game as well. And so it's a way of psyching people out that was fun, borrowed from RPGs. And yeah, I don't know, it's really not that much more complicated than that.
Yes. 这个比较相对来说容易去嘛，但也没很对，只要从这儿跳来就行。这个比较简单，然后这个很长，所以先把它放下。Simplifying the pit. Why is there a monster in the pit? 啊，这个是这个。
This level from the original prototype became the level you're now inside, the pit. The basic idea of the level is still intact. There's a key in a pit. You jump in to get the key. Type became the level you're now inside, the pit. The basic idea of the level is still intact. There's a key in a pit. You jump in to get the key, and maybe that's as far ahead as you thought about things, and now you're stuck, and then there's a surprise as you rewind and the key comes with you. The original level in the prototype had a bunch of monsters in it. It didn't fit all on one screen. It was more like 2 or 3 screens. And you had to climb up and go around to get to the pit. There was no graphical effect on the key like there is now. It's just, when you rewound, the key always came with you. And in fact, all keys in that prototype magically came with you when you rewound. We just didn't introduce any keys until World 3. It was only later that I had the idea that unrewindability could be a property placed on any object. The more I worked on Braid, the more I realized that focusing levels down, distilling their geometry into something more minimal, helped the player to see the ideas behind levels and to make plans of how to solve them. And when this was done, the experience of solving a level was stronger because the solution wasn't hidden behind a bunch of busywork steps or obscured by extra level geometry. Everything you needed was right there, stark on the screen. When I first reduced the pit to this level of simplicity, I worried that it was too simple, but time showed it was the right decision. So if simplicity is so good, why couldn't I just start there? Why was the initial design more complicated? Well, it's because I was trying to be a good designer. It's a general rule of good game design that you want to encounter a locked gate before you find the key to open it. Otherwise, the gate was never a barrier, and getting the key isn't an achievement. The gate just opens automatically because, hey, you are holding some key, and you didn't know why you needed the key when you got it. You just picked it up because, of course. Whereas if you encounter a locked gate first, Now you have an objective to guide your play through the rest of the level, trying to get the thing that will open that gate. Play is much more structured and purposeful. So I had given the level this tortured geometry in an attempt to satisfy the gate first rule. So you start at the entry to the level, you walk right, hit the gate, climb up, then left, then get the key, then come out and go back down to the gate. But this made the level convoluted and large. You couldn't see the whole level at once as you can now. As I continued to work on the game, I found that simplicity was much more important, and getting to the gate first wasn't strictly necessary, because if the level is small and simple enough, it's easy to notice the gate is right there on the screen. You see it as soon as the level loads, and obviously you need to get past it. You can also see the key right there on the screen, and you know you'll need to pick that up. So, this is a case where following the rules of good game design made the level much worse than it needed to be. So I like this version much better than the old one, but at the same time, the simplicity of this final design does confuse some people. The failure mode for people playing this level is pretty simple. They get stuck in the pit and don't think of using rewind to get out, and they just say, I'm stuck down here, there's obviously no way out. Sometimes people open the menu and exit back to the house. There is something about the geometry of the prototype, of hitting the gate, then having to go up and around, that maybe introduces you to the problem better, and that gives a slightly more solid impression that you should be able to come back whence you came. Hey, maybe there's something important back earlier in the level that I did wrong that I could rewind back to. Whereas, if the beginning of the level is just you jumping into the pit, and you can look and see there's nothing else back at the beginning, there seems to be nothing to rewind back to, and maybe no reason to think of rewind at all in the first place. Of course, I could have put up a hint that tells you to rewind if you stay in the pit too long, but this would run counter to the basic spirit of the game. I didn't want to ruin the magic of the moment by telling you what to do. The simplicity of this final design perhaps makes the moment of discovery more powerful. This is one of the first moments of real magic in the game, so it's important for it to be as simple as possible so it doesn't feel messy, contrived, or arbitrary, and so that you don't feel like you were deceived in some cheap way by a complex level. Why is there a monster in the pit? It's easy to kill and doesn't affect the outcome of the level. I've said the game is better when it's simpler, and wouldn't it be simpler just to have a pit with only a key in it? The player could just jump in, grab the key, and rewind out. Well, a mostly empty pit didn't feel right to me. I liked the idea of you having to do something in the pit, like jump on a monster, because otherwise it's obvious upon entering the level to just look ahead and see that once you jump into this pit, you can't get out. But if there's a monster down there, it can serve as an endpoint to the thought process. It's enticing to go jump on a monster. Maybe the player kind of thinks he might be able to bounce out of the pit, or who knows what will happen. There's something to do right now, and there's ambiguity about the future, so let's just do what we can right now. The version of the pit in the original prototype had 2 monsters in the pit in order to perhaps mislead the player a bit more into thinking he might be able to double bounce out. But I later decided this was unnecessary to create the endpoint, and was also a bit unfriendly because it seemed to imply much more strongly that the right answer is to double jump. So the game is directly misleading the player into repeatedly trying something unfun. Whereas with a single bounce, it's easy to see that you did it well and how high you went as a result, and that this is nowhere near the top of the pit. The presence of the monster was reinforced when I made the World 4 version of this level, because there the monster is crucial. Without it, I couldn't see any reason to have a World 4 version of the pit at all. And when there's a monster at the bottom of the pit every time, that creates a consistent pattern that we then break for the final pit in World 6. The final, and perhaps smallest reason for the monster is, I like that I could start the monster away from the key so that he walks forward and grabs it, making a sound cue, which causes the player's attention to be drawn to that area at the bottom of the pit shortly after the level starts, right when the player is first looking around to figure out what to do.
Why is there a monster in the pit? Simplifying the pit. ちょっと待ってね。OK。 先把顶上几个给它搞掉，然后这个 alternative design 这可能需要一口气打。Thoughts on making a claw slow down puzzle better 这 claw 还是挺操蛋的。Impassable， 我操 ，Impassable foliage。奇怪，哪看到可やばい呢？来。
The most reasonable solution to this level that we hope players will find involves setting up the timing for the plants so that monsters can walk freely through all 3 of them. But it's a little weird because this solution only makes sense if you clearly understand 2 things. 1, that each plant moves on a consistent cycle that doesn't change over time, which might seem obvious, but the game never states this in any way, and the player didn't need to know this in earlier levels when he was just trying to run through, so it's likely he just hasn't thought about it. And 2, that these particular plants happen to have the same cycle as each other, just offset from each other in time. Because if they didn't have the same cycle, then after you set up any specific timing, the pattern would disintegrate quickly. This might make it pretty hard to think about setting up such a pattern in the first place, because you might not see the underlying constraint that makes it make sense. If you're very used to playing video games, these realizations might come to you quickly, or you just might not even have to think about it. But people without so much game experience can be at a big disadvantage when it comes to puzzles like this. It's also perhaps a bit unsatisfying that the solution involves synchronizing the plants in a certain way, but the timings are offset from each other, so the final motion lacks order and doesn't communicate correctness, as opposed to a visually synchronized bobbing up and down in unison. I don't exactly remember, but I think I did this to make it harder, like finding the combination to a lock. You don't want the combination to be 111, or your stuff will get stolen. But the level might have been better if the combination were 111. You might imagine retuning the level so that a solution involves clearly synchronizing the plants with each other, which would make the solution more satisfying and would probably help people understand what they're trying to do in the first place.
World 1 and the Claw. World 1 and the Bunnies. World 1 and Gates. 啊，3个连在一起。啊，对，这个是 World 1，想 World 2了，这个是 World 1。
There are no plant monsters in these levels that lead to the finale because it wouldn't be very interesting. When time goes forward, the plants just move in periodic cycles. There's some time when they're out and deadly, and some other time when they're tucked away and safe, and then transition times during which they're also mostly deadly. When time goes backward, they would just go through the same cycles backward, which would not make any meaningful difference to gameplay. It would be almost exactly the same, except when the transition times are asymmetric and whether the snapping sound plays when the claw is going up or down. Who really cares about that, I thought. Now, there are plant monsters in the final level, but they're used just to constrain the pacing of that level in the same ways they might be used elsewhere in the game. But the behavior difference is mainly cosmetic, and at the time, I felt this wasn't good enough for the earlier levels, which are supposed to be about behavior differences, just like all the other worlds in the game. That said, in retrospect, it seems like I missed an opportunity for a fun intro level to this world. You could imagine you've just entered this world for the first time, and you see just these plants, and you got to get through them, and they're simulating backwards so that it looks and feels weird. But because it behaves the same as plants earlier in the game, you pretty much play it the same. Maybe the player doesn't even realize what's going on yet, that time is going backwards. And so that's the point of the level, to introduce the world in a way that is subtle and weird. I mocked up this idea, and you can see that over here.
啊，这个就是 alternative design，最多是3只。哦，这个跟那是不是一样的？ 啊，但我一旦进去的话就看不到了，是吧？耶，这我还想验证一下。这个不能不验证。あ、だからこれかなり長いな。一关一关一关一关的。啊，这个是 World 2，这是 World 3了。场景发生变化了。也，这不是World 3，这已经幻影了。残影。246，对，是这儿，这个是一样的。看时间就知道了。
This is my first attempt at a subtle introduction to World 1 that's about maybe noticing that the plants go backward, as mentioned over here. I'm not sure it would have been the best way to introduce the world, as it would take longer for players before they see what makes time unique in that world. But we did it here just for illustration's sake.
但你光看这个，你根本就看不出来时间再往后。这也是一个非常重要的原因，所以他根本就没有放 plant。
This is my
那果然就这个。哎 ，shit。
There aren't any levels with rabbits in World 1 because it didn't seem to add much to the concept, and frankly, it would have been really annoying to program, and maybe I don't even know how to make it make sense. The simpler monsters are relatively easy to program a backwards simulator for because they mostly just walk in a straight line. On the other hand, the rabbits make decisions about what to do based on where the player is. For example, if the player is at a certain range of distances, they decide to jump in an attempt to kill the player. In order to make this kind of decision backwards in time, the code for the rabbit, which has to just be normal code running forward in time because the computer's not magic, that code would have to say, it is plausible that I would have jumped toward the player, but missed, landing in the place where I am now, so let's do a big jump backwards. The rabbit has to have missed because if he didn't, the player would already be dead, which the player isn't. The rabbit would do his small little hops backward away from the player, which means you could push rabbits around the level, which would be neat. But it is hard for this to have meaningful consequences because they can't die or kill any other monsters. They're all simulating backwards, so they could only undie. And it just seemed messy and clumsy to try to come up with situations where rabbits were, for some reason, unkilling monsters. In the game before this, rabbits almost never kill monsters. And we would have to then somehow make it that the player can't just jump on those monsters himself, which is a very challenging level design constraint. Because if the player could just jump on those monsters himself, we don't need the rabbits at all, and this would make the puzzle feel very broken. Maybe if the simulation were mixed, and some monsters were running forward and others backward, interesting situations could be made, but I was doubtful the puzzles would be good, and this didn't match what I'd wanted to do story-wise, which was just to have all of World 1 moving uniformly backward relative to the player. The reason for that is, I had designed the final level with the princess first. These first few levels of World 1 then just had the task of getting us to that final level. Since the final level is not about monsters with mixed directions through time, it would have been defocusing to do that in the introduction and then anticlimactic not to use them in the final level. So, the whole idea of adding backwards simulating rabbits just seemed like a big mess that would not yield much good, so I made the judgment call that it wouldn't be worth even trying all this. When you're working on a game like this and have too much to do all the time and need to do huge amounts of work just to get the game done in any form, sometimes these judgment calls are necessary. But sometimes these guesses that the work would not yield good results are wrong. Maybe it would have made for exciting and interesting levels, and there would be a fun World 1 involving stuff that simulates in both directions. There could be more levels in this world that use reversal interestingly with other object types. For example, unlocked gates that you walk up to in order to unbreak a key, locking the gate, which now blocks monsters because it's locked, and allows you to use that key elsewhere, on a gate that is unrewindable so you could open it. Except, all this doesn't quite make sense, because the key would not be able to open things unless it was unrewindable itself, because opening things would require the key to be moving forward in time. But if the key is unrewindable, you wouldn't be able to pick it up in the first place because it would be going forward in time, not backward. It would stay broken. But the gate that key had unlocked would still close and block monsters, which might be interesting. Sometimes, when you start with an idea like this, it doesn't quite work, but you keep thinking about it and experimenting, you eventually find a version that will work. So, there may be a good idea hiding somewhere in that key thing, or there may be other situations that would work more naturally. But I did not think of them at the time, so I didn't do them.
Okay. 然后 development of the ring or ring 了是吧 the mechanics of time slow down. The pit 啊2个是吧
My very first conception of this world's mechanics was to do something like a black hole,
Black hole.
where the rate of passage of time slows down toward the center,
black hole.
lightly inspired by the way black holes seem to work in the real world. This harkened back to the original idea of the game, before development really started, of translating ideas from relativity, quantum mechanics, and so forth into the human scale, a bit absurdly, and seeing what that looks like. Even in Braid's code, if you were to look, you would see that the ring is still called a black hole.
这样
How did it end up as an engagement ring for the final game? After all, it could have been anything. My
anything,
first idea of how to manifest a black hole was that Tim would have some kind of sci-fi gadget that he would activate to create the time distortion effect. Insofar as the fiction is concerned, the time distortion would be a completely literal, hard sci-fi kind of device. But this felt wrong to me. The fiction of the game to that point had been more fanciful and metaphorical, so adding some kind of time disruption gadget just felt bad. It is very important to hone this sense of how your ideas feel when you consider them alongside the choices you've already made, combined into a hopefully coherent whole, and we'll talk about this in more detail elsewhere. To accord better with the game's fiction, and hearkening back to inspirations like Cosmi Comics, I wanted to make the device and the slowdown effect it creates less literal. The slowdown became hesitation and wariness, rather than fictionally a literal slowdown of time. It is inherently a literal slowdown for gameplay, so if it's also a literal slowdown in the fiction, we miss an opportunity to play with the idea. And at least to a first
literary inspiration.
The more ideas you can wrangle with in your game, times the amount you can explore each idea, determines the mental depth and complexity of your game. But of course, one can take this too far or execute badly. Even though the slowdown became metaphorical, it felt important to maintain the physics motif of the game, thinking about forces like gravity in our real universe. Since the magnitude of a force emanated from a point would decrease by some function of the distance, the overall pattern of force has circular symmetry. At each distance, there is a circle in space where the force is at the same strength. This is why gravity compacts planets and stars into spheres. Thus it rhymed that the object that emanates the force would be a circle. From there, and considering the goal to make this object metaphorical, the idea of a ring fell out naturally. And as soon as I had that idea, I felt really good about it, because again, consulting my sense of how well the elements of the game are working together, I felt that the roundness of the ring was metaphorical. That idea, I felt really good about it, because again, consulting my sense of how well the elements of the game are working together, I felt that the roundness of the ring was metaphorical in both directions. It represents a human commitment, but its roundness also represents physics itself in a more subliminal way, due to the aforementioned radial symmetry of forces. You might think a sci-fi gadget would be more likely to say physics, but that is more of a surface level, trivial idea. A clean circular piece of metal is a deeper, more meaningful, more subliminal representative of the physics motif. Also, there's a feeling with this metaphor that it reaches beyond what I explicitly understand with my reasoning mind and dips into unconscious territory. There are things about this choice of representations that feel good that I don't completely understand. My goal in designing this kind of game is to reach beyond my surface level understanding, wherever possible. So anytime I feel this way about a choice, it means the game is getting better. After the ring was initially implemented, rather than a pure physical force that decreases by distance, for gameplay purposes I tuned the slowdown so that it becomes constant inside an inner radius. Once there's an inner radius where behavior is materially different, it is a good idea to draw that radius so that the player can see clearly the place where the slowdown behavior changes to make the game more understandable and playable. Once the game is drawing a big ring on the screen for this purpose, the circular motif becomes reinforced. When we're sitting down to design a game, we get to decide everything about how it works. So, we have the high-level idea that there should be an object you could drop to slow down time. How do we decide exactly how it should behave, down to every detail? The game was inspired by strange phenomena created by the laws of physics, and more specifically, the slowdown effect was inspired by time dilation that happens at very high speeds or in very deep gravity wells, so we can start our thought process there. Since we are dropping a localized object, it is much more reminiscent of gravity wells than high speeds. The thing about gravity, or any other physical force, is that it is proportional to 1 divided by the squared distance between the two objects exchanging the force.
Right.
A simplified way of thinking about this 1 over r squared function is that it's happening because a given amount of force is produced at one place, then the waves or particles emanate out from that point in an ever-expanding sphere. As these mediating particles go out, their density decreases with the surface area of that sphere, which is proportional to r squared in the 3 dimensions of our world. 1 over r squared, and other functions like it, are continuous, so they change gradually with changes in spatial position. 1 over r squared changes very quickly when you're close to the origin, but very slowly in a way that creates only subtle analog differences when you get further out. Analog things are hard to deal with in puzzle games. In general, discrete things are easier for the player to reason about, and easier for the designer to make sure the gameplay experience is clean and not fiddly and not weird. If the speed that you go at changes quickly near the center of the ring, and this speed is a big factor in how puzzles get solved, which it must be, the whole idea of the world is to slow stuff down by placing the ring, then the puzzles would be subject to a lot of fiddliness based on the exact position where the ring is placed. So if you place the ring right next to an object, that object might go at 0.1 speed, 1/10 of normal speed. But if you nudge the ring just slightly over, close enough that it might be hard for the player to intentionally choose distances at this scale, the object might now go at 0.2 speed, which is twice as fast, which makes it very hard to be consistent gameplay-wise. And if we don't limit the slowdown rate and just put a singularity at the middle, then slowdown would become infinite as you approach the center, which can become very awkward for gameplay. If you walk too close to the center or accidentally fell in vertically, it could take a very long time to get back out. And since you manipulate the ring by physically picking it up, and you'd need to be near it to pick it up, this set of game design choices drives us directly into the awkwardness. Anytime you're making choices, and you see they result directly in an unpleasant situation like this, it's a sign you should change those choices. So it was clear to me, pretty quickly, that we wanted to limit the maximum slowdown, and didn't want the maximum slowdown rate to be changing very quickly near the ring. What should the maximum slowdown be? We want it to be slow enough that you can see the effects in an obvious way, because that's very helpful when solving puzzles, and also makes the game feel cool. But also, we want the ability to design levels with lots of tolerance. You want to be able to make puzzles with wide margins of player error when the player is executing the right solution, and this necessitates the slowdown amount to be pretty high. Also, and this may sound shallow, but I wanted the music and sound effects to sound cool as you walk through the slowdown area. At some basic level, the game is about seeing and feeling time distortion, so this may actually be less shallow than it seems. But if the maximum slowdown is too much, solving can become routinely tedious because it just takes too long to move through the affected space. And if the music plays too slow, You can no longer really hear it anymore, both because your brain no longer tracks sounds that are that slow in the same way as normal speeds, and because the sound waves lose most of their energy as they get stretched so far. So the music stops being cool, and you don't get as much information about gameplay state from the sound effects. For all these reasons, I settled on an inner radius of the size you can see in the game with a max slowdown factor of 5 times. This inner radius is drawn clearly as a bubble when you place the ring. There is no maximum outer radius, and this is perhaps a design failing, because there's no way to use the ring to affect one object without it affecting everything on the level. This makes levels like impassable foliage much more difficult and messy than they might otherwise have been. But I didn't want to impose an outer radius because I wanted the ring to be as physics-y as possible, and that requires the effect to travel outward forever. Maybe it was a mistake, I don't know. Earlier we said that in 3D the falloff would be 1 over r squared, and that this would probably change too quickly. When I tried it, yeah, it changed too quickly. I also tried 1 over r, which in addition to being simple, is what would actually happen in 2D space, and I didn't like that either. Just going by game feel, I settled on a function involving 2 to the minus r. It is this. Boiling the function down to its simplest form, it's just 1 minus 0.8 times 2 to the minus x, 2 to the minus r. It is this. Boiling the function down to its simplest form, it's just 1 minus 0.8 times 2 to the minus x, where x is the number of radii away we are, and we clamp x at 0, which makes the slowdown constant inside the just 1 minus 0.8 times 2 to the minus
2
x,
to the power of
where
minus
x
d
is the
over
number
r.
of radii away we are. Boiling the function down to its simplest form, it's just 1 minus 0.8 times 2 to the
bubble
minus
radius
x,
distance from
where x
center.
is the number of radii away we are, and we clamp x at 0, which makes the slowdown constant inside the radius. Here's the code from the game that actually implements this. You can imagine how you might like to change what would actually happen, and that this would probably change too quickly. When I tried it, yeah, it changed too quickly. I also tried 1 over r, which in addition to being simple, is what would actually happen in 2D space, and I didn't like that either. Just going by game feel, I settled on a function involving 2 to the minus r.
2 to the minus r.
It is this. Boiling the function down to its simplest form, it's just 1 minus 0.8 times 2 to the minus x, where x is the number of radii away we are, and we clamp x at 0, which makes the slowdown constant inside the radius. Here's the code from the game that actually implements this. You can imagine how you might like to change this behavior and what the consequences would be.
Literary inspirations 是有公式的，是吧？紧张 ，BGM 还在，是吧？这两个看来是镶嵌的，是吧？那这估计要把它看掉了，是镶嵌在这关里面的。The pit， literary inspirations， 这里最后一个了，那肯定要把它看完。
There are many factors that it's hard to place, but before the email, sort of the background that was percolating was Invisible Cities was one of my favorite books, and there were other works at the time that were obviously influenced by that, right? And one of these was a book called Einstein's Dreams by someone who is a physicist in his day job, Alan Lightman, right? And so both of these books take the form of a bunch of little vignettes that are 3 or 4 pages each that explore some different idea that is a little bit absurdist or somehow obviously not the case, right? Like not literal explorations and not logical explorations. So in Invisible Cities, you know, there are cities where I'm not going to remember any of them well enough to like do justice, but you know, there's a city where every point above, it's like on the water, right? Like Venice. And every point of the city above the water has a corresponding point
Okay.
below,
Okay.
but it's also conflated with the reflection in the water, and like people are spying on each other, and there are no secrets because from every point of the city you can see every other point by looking in the reflection. I'm completely butchering it, but
Okay.
it's things like that. It's things that
Right.
like don't exactly map to reality 100%,
Right.
right? The one that my company is named after, which of course I remember the best,
Okay.
is about, it's a city built by just looking up at the stars and seeing what the structure and the architecture is, and like, okay, let's copy that down here. And it always seems to be perpetually under construction and never completed, right?
Oh wow. Okay.
Which is maybe a little bit of a bad omen when you.
That's great.
Yeah.
But appropriate for a game development
Sadly.
life cycle, yeah.
Sadly. And then Einstein's Dreams was like that, but different. It was, many people know the story that Albert Einstein was a lowly, not particularly respected patent clerk before he did all his good stuff. And Einstein's Dreams is about him going home every day after the office and doing his physics at home and like just falling asleep thinking about what is the answer to how it could be that light behaves. Right. On the one hand, this is like maybe there are different topologies to the universe. If there's a fourth dimension, what is it and how it behaves?
Yeah.
But it's also used to, it's like transposed onto, let's say, the idea dimension of like what people are and how they behave and like how their relationships go and stuff, right? And so in a certain kind of universe, maybe light goes kind of slow and that makes everything cold and people are cold to each other or something. Again, I'm butchering it.
Okay.
But like that's the basic idea. And
so it's sort of like a very like microcosmic thing where all the different parts are exhibiting the same sorts of change. So we make one change, but we kind of pretend that change ripples through everything, even if it wouldn't necessarily make quite logical physical sense that was true.
Yeah, sometimes it varies a little bit.
Okay.
What I would say is that there's a constant use of laws of physics in an analogical way, like to make analogies with like ways that behavior could be. And sometimes that's more literal and sometimes it's less literal,
I
right?
See.
Now that even, it's very clear to me now, and maybe it even was then, but that actually owes a lot to another set of Calvino stories called the Cosmic Comics stories.
Okay.
Which is very explicitly about that too. It's like, so one of the early Cosmic Comics stories is like, there's a guy who's just like rotating in space around, like he's in a certain part of the galaxy, and his life is just many rotations of the galaxy.
Okay.
And he's very alone. And once in a while he passes maybe a mark that somebody else made, and he wonders like, what is this and who made it and where did it come from, and that kind of a thing. Or another one is, it's at many different scales. So another one of the stories is, you could imagine the moon being much closer to the Earth and with a more eccentric orbit, such that sometimes it comes a lot closer and sometimes it's further. And gravity's a little bit different, so that like maybe the ground kind of melts up like cheese a little bit. And there's like an expedition where it comes so close at a certain time that like we're gonna cross and we're gonna go to the moon by like throwing ropes up there and like climbing up there, right? It's that kind of story, and they're very entertaining, and I recommend them to anyone who's interested, because they're all very readable, because the stories are often very short and they have an enjoyable idea that they get to very quickly. But all of this, I had read as much Calvino as I could get my hands on, and all of that was influential on what Braid was, although don't blame him if you don't like the text in the game, because it's very different from anything he would have written, right? Part of what I was consciously doing is like not copying, right? Like, let's make this its own thing, even though it's heavily influenced. But so all that was flying around sort of in my mind at some point. Like, I wanted to do a game version of what I liked about these stories, right? Braid's startup behavior was unusual at the time, and remains so even today.
这一
When
样
Braid starts up, it drops you presenting the
啊，这是 splash screen。
but up splash to launch you could play immediately was the best. And that's how it is today.
对，这看过了。Literary inspirations，错。然后的话就是这个 alternative designs， 哎，这个是一个大坑。Three easy pieces 啊，这是另外一种，真的走过去了吗？啊，これはダメか。而且这一关もしかして什么要素都有了。啊，戒指又是有了，我操，全能了。啊 ，no old graphics here。这个是那个 three easy pieces 吗？好像是。
At the very first level of World 2, there's a few tutorial-ish things that are just like, here's some puzzle pieces that are kind of easy, that you do various things to get, just to show you the kind of things you do in this game, right? One of the very first ones was, there's one of these platforms that goes, I don't know if this was in the version that you guys play, it might have been.
You mean the first, like, alpha build?
Yeah.
Okay.
There was like a platform, you know, at the very end of what I'm about to say, there's a puzzle piece that you can see, and you're like, I need to get that.
Okay.
So there's a platform with a gap you have to jump across
Right.
to a narrower platform.
Right.
With another gap to a narrower platform.
Right,
With
yeah. 这个
another
team
gap
好猥
to
琐。
a narrower platform with another gap, and there's like 9 platforms increasingly narrow, and
Right.
like the last ones are
Right.
absurdly thin compared to your character.
Yes.
Which is kind of bad because like even at that point, it's like you would stand on a platform or not based on whether the center point of your character was
Right.
located on the span of the platform, right?
Right.
So it's like, are you supposed to read the game's mind there? But that was like funny because there's no way you would do that in another game.
Right. Right.
That ended up
What?
getting taken out. In part, like Microsoft complained about it, but I was also like, yeah, that's been in the game since really early on, and it's no longer quite the quality of experience that I want to have.
Microsoft complained about it?
They did a thing, so in early 2008, when the game was
Okay.
getting close to kind of being done,
Okay.
they did a whole frickin' playtest lab thing about it, right?
Oh, okay.
And they decided to tell me, here is how you should change your game based on the results of the playtest lab. And I
Okay.
said,
这不难。
well, this would make more sense if I could see the raw data. And they were like, no, we're not going to send you any data. I, as the producer, am just going to give you my opinion about what you should do. And I was
Wow,
like,
right.
no.
Okay.
But I did change that one thing because it was like, you know, sometimes you already kind of know something's not that good. And it's like, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
后面就一样了是吧？啊，没了，就这个了，这个是有点变态。这个我如果不用 rewind 一遍成功，其实可以恐怖自己了。啊，其实你也不能用戒指。これ一遍はかなりむずいね。好。这个需要空中 air control，very decent air control 你才能做到。It's absolutely not easy。いやお前はどうでもいいや，ガキ。啊，这人直接上来了。Hunt。啊，这是贝塔关是吧？有什么区别吗？啊，中间这个裂开的。
One problem that I see sometimes with Hunt is that people get up to the platform on the left here, and they've already killed the monster below as expected, so there's no visual sign of the right way to get across to the right. But there's a monster here on the platform with them. Or if they killed it already, as soon as they rewind, that monster is the first one resurrected. So a player might spend a long time trying to bounce off this monster as it walks over to the right side of the platform, because it's the only obvious possibility for solving the puzzle. The jump doesn't come anywhere close to getting you across, and you do bump your head on the ceiling for reasons explained here. So this approach can't work, but a player is likely to try several times frustratingly before trying something else, because there simply is no visual cue of any other way up there. Maybe that's fine. I thought so at the time. Hey, it's a hard puzzle, let people be a bit stuck. But now I wish I had encouraged players to be stuck in a cleaner way. The cleanest revision to try as a designer might be just to delete this monster so that the platform is empty. This messes up a subtle bit of symmetry of the level, that there's exactly one monster on every walkable surface, but it's probably worth it. But removing this monster would somewhat ruin the World 4 version of Hunt. You could bring back that monster only in World 4. Or you could do what I've done here, split this platform so that the monster still exists, but doesn't come anywhere near the gap you need to cross. This removes one major avenue of frustrating wrong attempts, which is maybe good. It makes the level easier, which is maybe bad.
这个应该看过了 ，flow。
If you bounce off this monster's head, starting from somewhere on its own platform. If you bounce off this monster's head, starting from somewhere on its own platform. It seems almost like you can reach the platform on the to move the platform you're standing on further left, but we can't because you'd have to move it so far in second floors and say, hey, why didn't you just move the third floor up? Natural process already pro. All I've added here can bounce from this monster. I didn't see any solution that wasn't worse than the problem, so I left it as is.
这个是看过的，这不是有判定了吗？啊，没判定，刚好碰不到。好，这个要想到那儿都不容易，有3关，还有钥匙，哪来的钥匙？ Where is the key？ 没有钥匙。Crossing the gap。这哪一关啊？ 哦，这个是能，这个是专属关卡是吧？かなり複雑やな。我操！啊，这关看那里母子一点。来 ，crossing the gap。 就一个这个是吧？也就是我既可以通过这个门走到下一关，也可以通过那个门走到下一关，是吧？这个应该也是可以的，这是一样的。那为什么要给你2个门？有什么区别吗？ It only makes you confused. 啊，这是那个，好吧。
In the interview with Mark, we talked about separating this high jump puzzle into its own level to decrease confusion and to increase focus. This is what that might look like, and I think this version might have made the original game better. But The game as a whole consists of many levels with multiple puzzles on them and only a few levels with single puzzles. If I change this level to have only one puzzle, it would shift the game further in the direction of single puzzle levels, which would change how the game feels overall. But you could do that. You could imagine redesigning the whole game to have one puzzle per level. The result would feel pretty different, I think. Some puzzles would be easier due to increased clarity and focus, and that's probably good. But the game would also feel more like other generic puzzle games, which often have one puzzle per level. And some other basic functional things about the game would get uglier. For example, on the cloud screens, we would need to have a big row of 12 doors every time.
Big row of 12 doors 啊，得一关一关分开了。如果真一关一关分开的话，确实需要一大堆关卡。
Mark suggested making the puzzle easier by hinting that you need to make a monster bounce off your head. Here's the idea I came up with during that discussion. It works. Mark suggested making the puzzle easier by hinting that you need to make a monster bounce off your head. Here's the idea I came up with during that discussion. It works, but it's pretty ugly because of the weird geometry and the way the player is almost trapped on the left side of the level. In the rest of the game, you can just walk to the next level anytime you're stuck, except, of course, in the boss levels, where being locked in is part of the drama. So locking the player in here on a normal level is really not great. Not only because we're blocking the player's ability to experiment, but because we're diluting the uniqueness of the boss levels. One way that puzzle games end up being mediocre is when designers make stuff like this and just decide, hey, it's good enough. To really produce high-quality work, you want to notice ugliness like this when it happens, to see all this weighty stuff has been added to the level, just to make an excuse to bounce a monster, and then ask yourself, can't I find a more elegant way to do this? Then you could try different ideas in your mind or in the level editor and judge to yourself whether they're becoming uglier or more beautiful. Every good puzzle designer I know practices this aesthetic sense in some way. The good news is that there isn't an objectively correct answer, which means you can develop your own personal voice and style. But without some strong idea of what's good that is reality-based to some degree, you won't really be able to make good puzzles.
这个应该最后一个了。
After making the previous level, I was dissatisfied with its ugliness. Remember that the goal was just a hint at the high jump solution by having you bounce a monster off your head. I worked on the level further and came up with this version, which provides a much simpler reason to do such a bounce. I think this version is obviously much better than the other one, but if I were to choose, I still like the first revision better, the single screen puzzle that has no hints.
Single screen puzzle with no hint.紧张啊！这一课算是 one of the hardest， 倒也不是没道理。OK， 但你这怎么搞？我没有钥匙，哪来的钥匙？去看一下有没有钥匙。啊，钥匙这儿，钥匙怎么在这儿呢？这个就是那一关。而且还有残影。I'm fucking back。然后你还需要类似操作，这来得及吗 ？Wow, I think this is not that easy. 啊，一样。Clover。哇哦，这个钥匙是不能 rewind 的是吗？哇哦，戒指不能用，有那个残影也没有，就绿光的关卡。哦，对，但是好像有2把钥匙。啊，这里还有一把。这肯定开这个，我操 ！Piece of jerk。啊，这样就死了 ，fuck it。这为什么叫 clover？ 3叶草。damn。耶。这个应该是一直能启动的。这关没什么难度，很无聊。可以了，过了。哦。Right. What the fuck? 这个嘛，我觉得可以算 easy 吧，1到6可以标个6。这好像都不算3嘛，算4。把图莱斯拿到了，这什么都没有写，他就是什么都没有写。What is even this?
Here we show various versions of the key passing puzzle so we can contrast them.
Contrast them.
This is the version of the puzzle that's present in the released game, but the solution is even more obvious here because the key is in a small area with a wall to the right, so the only possible way the key could go is to the left. In the actual game, the key is located next to the rabbit distraction puzzle where you can keep running to the right a little
对，
bit.
那个欺骗性很
I did
强
this
一
intentionally to create a little more uncertainty
欺骗性
about
贼
where to
强
go with the key. You solve this puzzle by jumping across the pit so that the key almost makes it to the other side, but then you rewind and let your shadow do the jump while you stand in the proper place to receive the key. To solve the puzzle, you have to start your jump very close to the edge of the platform, which is a negative to me. I would like it if the puzzle gave you a lot more slack in terms of where to jump, which is part of a philosophy discussed over here. But if you as the designer size the pit so that the player can successfully jump from further back, then a more experienced player could instead run up to the very edge and jump and make it across the pit alive, which ruins the entire puzzle. So the pit cannot be very narrow. But even with a pit that you can't jump across, we still have the problem that because the key has to get far enough that you can grab it later, you have to be able to almost jump across. And this violates one of the core principles of puzzle design we mentioned in the link above, which is that if you aren't supposed to be able to jump across a gap, it should be clear that you can't do it to avoid player fumbling and frustration. You shouldn't even come close to making that jump, but you have to for the puzzle to work. To help mitigate this situation, I made the left side of the pit higher than the right. Now, when you attempt to jump, at the far side your feet are well below where they need to be to successfully land, so it's more clear that you just can't do it. But because the key is held higher than foot level, it still ends up in a good place. But I can't make the left side too high, otherwise it lets the player jump from the left to the right, which I also didn't want, because this makes the solution a little too obvious or trivial feeling. After all, if you just jumped over the pit to grab the key, of course you're going to try to jump right back. Also, in order for the puzzle to work well, When you do it wrong and jump into the pit and die, the key needs to fall to a position where the live player can no longer reach it. Otherwise, the timing element of the puzzle would be gone because you could grab the key anytime after the shadow jumps into the spikes. Getting the key more easily would not only make the puzzle less interesting to solve, it would sap drama and gravitas, because these are much stronger when the about-to-die Tim desperately passes the key to the alive Tim. In order for this key passing to work at all, a rule had to be specified in the gameplay code. If the shadow Tim is holding a key that's shared among both realities, and the live Tim intersects with that key, the live Tim takes possession from the shadow Tim. Because the game is a simulation that should respond deterministically to all events that could happen in its world, the game must have some consistent rule about what happens in this case, but as the designer, you get to decide what that rule is. Maybe a more natural rule would be that whoever was already holding the key keeps it. But I wanted this specific puzzle to work, so I made the rule the way it is now. You could think of this extra rule as being a tiny blemish on the puzzle
blemish.
But given that the active reality already feels more important than the shadow reality, this rule may seem unsurprising to the player if he thinks clearly about it at all, which most players won't.
还有2个，这个 gap width 啊，就这个是吧？
The idea for this level and can't figure out
这看过。
all the way is happening. This is the first version of the key passing puzzle that I thought of and implemented in the game.
哦，拿不回来了
It's
是吧？
simple, and it doesn't require the somewhat precise
对对
counting
对
of
对
the，final
这
version.
好 simple。
Instead, you just pass the key through the little hole in the wall. But I didn't like it because it seems so obvious and contrived. Obvious because the hole grabs so much attention. I need to get this key from one side of the wall to the other, and what else would such a hole be for? When you solve the puzzle, it can't really feel magical because obviously that weird hole is there so you could put the key through it. Whereas there are spike pits elsewhere in the game, so that pit's very existence didn't raise attention. That it seemed too contrived is a bit of a different thing than being obvious, but it's not totally unrelated. Because there are no small holes and thin walls elsewhere in the game, it's like we're adding a new concept into the level geometry that the player needs to recognize, but just for this puzzle, and we'll never see it elsewhere. I try to avoid this kind of thing in my designs, because when you do this a lot, it makes the game feel weighted down and ugly.
这个地方是过不去的。
Here's a version of key passing where you can here's a version of key passing where you can give the key to a monster who takes it through the tunnel for you. This is less weird than the previous version because such monster tunnels already exist throughout the game. This version of the puzzle seems too easy to solve by mistake, though. If your shadow is holding the key and accidentally gets killed by the monster, the key will naturally end up on the other side of the tunnel without you intending that to happen at all. When the player experiences an accidental puzzle solve, it can confuse him and reduce his confidence that the makers of the game have him in good hands, which can have consequences down the road. To decrease the odds of an accidental solve, here I've put extra monsters atop the various platforms to help put the player in the mood to stomp monsters. Because if the player casually stomps the monster that would have been the one going through the tunnel, obviously an accidental solve will not happen. The extra monsters also make the solution less of a blatant giveaway. It's not, hey, here is just one monster walking through this tunnel, it must be the answer. Another positive aspect is that this version gets rid of the special rule if the shadow is carrying the key and the active player touches it, he takes the key away from the shadow.
Puzzle game 最关键的就是当你知道怎么做了，你就可以非常干净漂亮的解决这道题。那么做不出来当然很操蛋，但有些设计的不好的就是 by random trying， 就你也不知道你要干嘛，就不停的试，不知不觉就做出来。虽然你做出来，但你不会有任何的这个成就感。这种感觉其实比较糟糕的。就当一款游戏打着全部是这种东西的话，不知不觉你就已经失去兴趣了。把这看完吧，把这款子修了。下一期应该能把这个 monologue 结束掉了，独白是吧？啊，这不长，我操，这个不是能回自己东西，上都上不来。
Here is a simpler version of the mimic distraction puzzle. I did think of this form of puzzle when designing the original game, but I felt it would be too easy to solve accidentally, or Even when solving deliberately, it just wouldn't feel as strong. The aspect of the final design of having to enter a long passage from both sides necessitates more premeditation, and it just feels better to me. But that final design requires special programming to get the rabbit not to leave its area, because if he did go out from beneath the overhang, you could easily just jump on him and kill him. That is to say, this rabbit does not behave quite like the other ones, and the only reason for that is to implement this puzzle. Some designers would consider this a hack that acts as a mild blemish on the game. Here, to prevent the rabbit from being killed,
这关这个兔子确实不太正常，它一旦过了某个区域，它不会动。
is a simpler version of the mimic distraction puzzle.
Distraction
I did
puzzle.
think of this form of puzzle when designing the original game, but I felt it would be too easy to solve accidentally, or even when solving deliberately, it just wouldn't feel as strong. The aspect of the final design of having to enter a long passage from both sides necessitates more premeditation, and it just feels better to me. But that final design requires special programming to get the rabbit not to leave its area, because if he did go out from beneath the overhang, you could easily just jump on him and
然后
kill
这
him.
关就简单了。
That is to say, this rabbit does not behave quite like the other ones, and the only reason for that is to implement this
它没
puzzle.
有守规矩。
Some designers would consider this a hack that acts as a mild blemish on the game. Here, to prevent the rabbit
Blemish.
from being killed, we make the player climb up into a restricted area from which the rabbit cannot leave and cannot be attacked from above. Thus, no special programming hack is required. This initial cliff on the left is here because the rabbit chases you very slowly when you are far away. So, if you were able to wake him up and then walk to the left side of the level, you could coax him to walk all the way over to the left. Then you could successfully race to the ladder and win without using the parallel universe at all. Because that would break the puzzle, we prevent it. Today, with much more design experience, do I like this version of the puzzle better? Probably, as I'm more of a purist about these weird hacks. But there's still something enticing about the symmetry of you and your shadow entering a tunnel from opposite sides, having the rabbit chase you in opposite directions. I wonder if, by working on this further, I could come up with an even better version of this puzzle that retains that symmetry.
对，这关是对称的，真正的那个最后的成品 level 是不对称的，好像斜的吧，我记得。对，那个这个斜的，是个斜的回字，就跟这个像，斜的回字形，然后这里是兔子，你要从左边右边来引。然后现在这个门的位置是一片拼图 ，OK， 先打到这儿，这样这个 alternative designs 还有一部分，这个下期肯定能结束了，然后就可以打成什么 special topics 嘛，反正按顺序。这有多少人呢？看一下啊。Special lingual topics, misdirection and excuses。啊，这个是来挡子弹的。Shake my boots， 而且底下还能下去。結構長くて臭い。Reprises， 我操，好多啊！Holy shit！OK， 把它拼都拼了。这样，就先这样。OK， 妈，这据说是有15个小时的长度。这15个小时如果真的指的是他整个采访评论的长度的话，那么我起码是要花16期以上。中间这个通关时间肯定不算的，不算在这个15小时内。但你必须要走到对应的地方，你才能听东西。